Okay, the Andrea Yates murder case. Fairly gruesome, really dark, gruesome, well-known case from now several years ago, from 2001, in which this woman, Andrea Yates, drowned her 5 children at home in the bathtub when she was there with them by herself. Of course, pleading later insanity or some sort of mental illness in order to mitigate her actions. She was on several different psychotropic medications leading up to this. She was hearing voices, according to her own testimony. She had paranoid beliefs that TV shows and things were directed at her, that her mother-in-law had secret cameras hidden in her house. She also had this kind of religious aspect to her thinking as well, in the sense of creating in her own mind these expectations and conditions based on her interpretations and understandings of scriptures, and thinking that her children, before they reached certain age of accountability, that if they reached that age, that they would be cursed because she was a bad mother, and these different very tragic circumstances, but lays out this very gruesome murder case. So the defendant is Andrea Yates, seen over here. This first line, actually, let me highlight my mouse. Let me do that. So Andrea Yates is the defendant in this case. There we go. She has several medical issues during this time on several different psychotropic medications. There was discussion leading up to the time of reduction of a certain drug that she was on for dealing with paranoid schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, excuse me. And there was some debate about whether or not that should have been reduced, whether it was reduced in its proper amounts over time. Some doctors recommend reducing that more gradually. So anyway, Andrea Yates committed this crime on June 20th, 2001. It was arrested for the murder of her 5 children by drowning them in the bathtub. And so the debate was not really over whether or not she committed the crime, whether or not there was evidence for whether she committed it or someone else, whether she was innocent or guilty of the act, but whether or not the circumstances in her own mind and thinking created a situation in which she could be held criminally liable for her actions in the same sense of someone committing premeditated first-degree murder. And so this is really more of the question of the case. Now, her plea is, of course, not guilty. Now, this didn't mean that she didn't commit the murders, but she pled not guilty by reason of insanity. So the attorneys entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, NGRI, and the Texas Penal Code explains what that is. And here's the quote. It says, "It is an affirmative defense to prosecution that at the time of the conduct charge, the actor, as a result of severe mental disease or defect, did not know that his conduct was wrong," or in this case, her conduct was wrong. Now, here's where the center or the focus of the debate is. Was she truly responsible? Did she not know or not know her conduct was wrong? And there were several physicians willing to testify for the defense. There was only one testifying for the prosecution. Now, they all agreed that Andrea Yates had these mental issues. But it's fairly interesting, and in the Resnick article, which you can see in my um, footnotes and is in my references page on these slides, Resnick debates and goes back and forth with this other doctor who was key to the prosecution, Dr. Yates, and their discussions with Yates and about her and their study of the case, and also bringing their medical knowledge to bear on these things. Now, Andrea Yates did admit that she knew what she was doing was wrong. This was a key part of Park Dykes' testimony. She knew what she was doing was wrong. She waited until her husband and other family members or other people were out of the house. So this brings up kind of a premeditated nature. And she also called the police and told them that she had committed this crime. That being said, Dr. Resnick says on the other side later, analyzing this from 2007, that that's not really the focus. The focus is, did she believe, despite what the laws were saying and people's approval or disapproval of her act, did she believe what she was doing was really in the best interest of her children? Having the understanding that she did, that if she did not do this, they would be condemned and be seen by God as unclean and unrighteous because of her understanding of her own failures as a mother. And so she, Dr. Resnick argues instead that what's really at the heart of this case is, while she did know that others would perceive it as wrong, and that in normal circumstances it would be wrong to commit these murders, that she was trying to achieve a greater good that was in her mind based on the nature of her mental illness, even though mental illness is an outdated term. Most people aren't aware of that, but it's in the common parlance. So that becomes kind of the heart of the case. But so that she's arrested. Then the criminal trial takes place. The responsible parties here are the judge, the prosecuting attorney, of course, for the state, the defense counsel, or several attorneys defending Andrea Yates, the jury, law enforcement testimony, witnesses. Now, this doesn't mean necessarily people who were there, but people who have knowledge of the circumstances, including law enforcement, and then the forensics analysts who worked on this case. Now, of course, the plea is not guilty, as I just mentioned. Now, the jury does give a guilty verdict, and this was a death penalty case in normal circumstances. And the county she was in Texas, also the state of Texas, does have capital punishment. It does have the death penalty. They render a guilty verdict. However, in their sentencing, they vote not to use the death penalty because of the insanity defense. So the guilt is 10-2 in favor of guilty, 2, of course, referring to the NGRI, not guilty by reason of insanity. And evidently, the jury did not have a unanimous vote in this case, which, a lot of jury cases, like the famous case, the movie of 12 Angry Men, you need unanimous, right, for guilty. Now, this was laid down as a guilty verdict. All 10, I think, did, in a sense, understand she was guilty of this crime. The act had been committed by Andrea Yates. However, should the punishment in this case, is it appropriate to render the death penalty? And that's where the disagreement arose. So she was sentenced to basically life in prison. She would not be eligible for parole for 40 years. And that's referred to here, sentencing involving the judges, jury, sentencing in general, involving judges, jury, law enforcement, the prison system, who enforces the sentencing, is what I mean by that. Andrea Yates is sentenced to 40 years. She's actually sentenced longer than that. It's life in prison, but 40 years is when she'd be eligible for parole. Now, there is an appeal, and this is where the responsibility of the defense counsel continues. The defense counsel appeals, goes to another case because of procedural mistakes. This is often what appeals come from. Not that usually that, though it can happen, witnesses lie or misconstrue the truth on purpose or things like that, or that there's some corruption in the system, though although it definitely exists. Appeals are usually on procedural grounds, that in some level, all the moving pieces of all the people working on any particular case at any particular time may not have followed rules to perfection, and therefore there is, in many cases, grounds for appeal, to take the case to a higher court for the possibility of a different ruling. Now, this I put here: false testimony, false witness. It kind of sounds like the biblical sense of someone lying, which can happen and does happen in the court system. But in this case, it was, I believe, an erroneous misstatement of Dr. Park Yates, who was the doctor who walked through thinking, okay, in his interviews with Andrea Yates, he talked to her. He determined she did know what she was doing was wrong. She knew, she premeditated the act. She waited till other people left the house and she was alone. She called the police and told them she committed a criminal act, all these things. Now, one of the things that all that Yates stood by, and all that is valid, has a point. But one of the things that Yates mentioned is during his cross-examination, shown here, is that she had done this because of a TV show. Now, most people know the popular TV show Law and Order, a criminal drama, and he said that he believed he remembered seeing on television an episode, because he was a consultant for the script of Law and Order. So they would ask him forensics questions and make sure things were accurate to a certain degree in the show, in order to create this kind of realistic crime drama. And so he remembers consulting on an episode, or talking about an episode of Law and Order, in which a mother drowned her children, killed her children in a bathtub. And he said that given Andrea Yates's paranoia about television in general, with commercials and other things like this, that he mentioned that offhand, and implied that had happened, that episode had aired before Andrea Yates had committed this crime, when in actuality it had not aired until after this crime had committed. So there's no way it could have inspired her to commit this crime. So because of that statement in error, understandably, not, I believe, not maliciously, there's a retrial, there's an appeal. The verdict is voted not guilty by the jury, as is seen over here in this bubble. The jury renders a not guilty verdict by reason of insanity, that Yates was committed to the charge of a hospital. The doctor wanted her to continue to stay there. Later, the judge sentences her. Moving on down the line, the judge sentenced to Yates to remain in the hospital for another year. Now, the responsibilities of those in the courtroom, just generally, there can be a lot of responsibilities. Andrea Yates, to whatever level, and I'll come circle around and talk about her last, in a sense, but Andrea Yates is in some level responsible for her actions. If you take her out of the equation, these murders would not have taken place, arguably. So whether or not she had an understanding of the interest of her children in some other maybe distorted sense is in question, certainly. But Andrea Yates's acts in this cannot be discounted as to consider her a non-moral actor in any sense. Um, Now, also, you could also assign levels of circles of responsibility in her family and understanding of what was going on with her, the medical personnel dealing with her, assigning her medication, uh, those different areas of degrees of responsibility. Of course, the crime and law enforcement, the forensics, the investigators are responsible for gathering data, gathering facts, gathering evidence, bringing testimony to bear. The trial, the judge is responsible for these procedural rules of the courtroom, interpreting the law, explaining the law, prepping the jury, sentencing eventually. The law enforcement investigate, interrogate, and collect evidence. Witnesses are to provide accurate testimony as far as they understand it, and tell the truth as reliably as they can, but also to provide, in this case, situational expertise, like Dr. Dietz and other physicians, as to the mental state of Andrea Yates and others. Sometimes these experts are brought in as expert witnesses or expert testimony. Um, Defense counsel is, of course, to lay out the case for acquittal and to request an appeal, which happened in this case as well. The prosecution is to present the case for conviction on behalf of the state in order to punish a crime. And then the jury is to listen to the evidence, supposedly to remain impartial. Of course, there's some real world issues with that, but that's the goal. And then their job is to convict or acquit based on what they've heard and their understanding of the law. The jury also understood they were what was called uh, a death qualified jury, meaning a death sentence qualified jury, which meant that they understood the process of what they were going through to be on this type of criminal case, in that they knew that voting guilty could lead to and result in the death penalty in this particular case. So this was a death qualified jury in the first case. And had that added responsibility laid out before them, which is not quite the same level of pressure, I'll say, as other criminal juries that they have to deal with. Now, Andrea Yates, kind of interesting. One of my students was debating with another student about the Telltale Heart, that famous Edgar Allan Poe book, in their English class. And they're having this great discussion. Their teacher, I'm sure he'd be very happy to know that they're talking about literature in another class, getting into it and being interested. And their discussion surrounded, if the man who committed the murder in the Telltale Heart was insane the whole time, then is he really guilty of murder? Because he's hearing this heart beating under his floor. Or is he's certainly guilty of the act, but is he really guilty of premeditated murder in that sense? Or was it his insanity driving him to commit the murder and then expressing itself in him hearing this beating heart under the floor, eventually leading him to his dramatic confession? And the students brought it up to me, and I tried to encourage them to continue debating and talking about this. But one of the elements I added in that I think they forgot, and maybe instructive here, maybe not, this is just a comment, was the element of guilt that was forgotten. Uh, Telltale Heart is a story not ultimately about murder, but about the effect of guilt on someone's mindset, on somebody's soul, on somebody's psyche. That guilt can drive into madness. And so this incredible feeling of guilt after committing the murder leads the main character in Telltale Heart to have these paranoid fantasies about the guilt of what he has done under the floor, and that others are going to find out. And it eventually drives him into madness and to committing and to admitting that he committed this crime. And guilt was no doubt a part of Andrea Yates's crime. There was a feeling, rightly or wrongly, I'm talking about feeling guilty, I'm not talking about actual guilt at this point. There was a feeling of undue guilt that she had latched onto with regard to her role as a mother, with regard to how she was raising her children, with regard to her responsibilities, with regard to them. And this guilt and this pressure continued to weigh on her, probably, if not necessarily creating, but exacerbating the situation into which she felt like she had to take action. Now, guilt, in the sense of the effect it can have on the human mind, the human soul, is sometimes underrated, in that now it's very clinical in the sense of were chemicals in their brain causing this or that action, reaction, knowledge of what they were doing was right and wrong, the clouding their moral judgment, distorting their ethical capacity. But there's also this aspect of guilt, that how do we judge that understanding of that self-understanding through guilt. Now, here are some references. Just talk through those briefly. This one was useful. McClellan, Mental Health and Justice, as a case study of Andrea Yates, laid out a lot of this. This is referenced, not really used a lot, but Resnick wrote a book, Child Murder by Parents, and talked about just the natural moral revulsion that is very prevalent when people hear that parents have murdered their children, and what that means for a criminal procedure where that is the case. He also wrote a very helpful paper, the Andrea Yates case, Insanity on Trial, where he explains a lot of these details and kind of walks through the differences of opinion in the medical world as to what this is. And then, of course, the Texas Penal Code, that lays out that explanation of what not guilty by reason of insanity is. So hopefully that lays out the case fairly well, explains the details of it, lays out the responsibilities of the various parties involved, and gives an explanation of the case in a fairly comprehensive way.